Okay, for the consumer, the key concerns that we have is, for one, people are now going to be even worse off in terms of their financial planning and their retirement readiness. Because prior to the two-part system and all the research that we've done and the research that we've seen out there, only just over 20% of South Africans can afford to retire as it stands.
Hi, I'm Terence Kommel, and I have the great pleasure of speaking to Farzana Botha from Sanlam. Thank you for making the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great. I think a topic that's on everyone's mind at the moment is this new two-part retirement legislation, or as it's being colloquially called, the two-part retirement system. Can you talk to what it is and why it's been introduced in South Africa?
Absolutely. So it is a new retirement system that's coming into effect on the 1st of September. Now, traditionally, retirement products, for example, a retirement annuity, had no access until retirement, unless, of course, there was a disability or a death. Now you will be able to access a portion of it in a savings pot. So that savings pot has been created from the 1st of September. And then there will be a vested pot as well as a retirement pot going forward. So as a result of this new system and these segments that are being created within the product, it is now called two-part retirement system.
In terms of Sanlam's adaptations to the changes in the retirement landscape, how has it prepared itself and pivot to include the new legislative requirements?
Well, it was quite a mammoth task, if I'm honest, because for one, our products were designed based on those traditional methods of retirement, expecting to only pay out on death or disability or at retirement. Obviously, the products were priced for such things, and in terms of accessibility, clients couldn't just call in and ask for a withdrawal. So in order to adjust and adapt to these relevant changes, we had to look to see what are some of the system requirements that we need to create capacity for and changes that needed to be made. We had to consider what are the product development changes that needed to be made. We had to ready staff and competencies to do that. We had to have extensive discussions with the market and with people to understand what are the needs and how to make sure that the changes that we make are client-centric. And then we had to go ahead and do those implementations and communicate those things to the client. So it was quite a task, and we are still in the process of doing that as a readiness exercise.
How long has it taken to make these changes as a system?
Some of those changes are quicker than others, considering we're a huge organization. We've been around for over 100 years. And I think that because of those legacy systems and the number of policies we have, it takes long. However, we've been actively working on it for almost 2 years now, ever since we heard about the impending changes. We've been involved in discussions with the governing bodies and all the people who are putting this together. So based on that, we had the benefit of knowing what's to come and create the readiness over the last couple of years.
Awesome. In terms of those trying to analyze where they were to where they are, let's go into a little bit more detail between a traditional, let's call it the current retirement annuity system or retirement system versus the Newport system. What are the big distinctions besides just savings or access, and how does that differentiate the lay consumer?
Well, there's two key things that we need to unpack first. So there's the pension and provident fund world, which revolves around your corporate benefits. So clients who work for companies and organizations, typically they get a pension or a provident fund, and they were not able to access the money there unless they had resigned from their job, and then suddenly the money became accessible, right? And some people found themselves in financial need, and the stats show that a lot of people were resigning just to be able to access that money, right? Which created a preservation problem because that money was meant for retirement. So every time a person left their employment, they took that money and they were starting from ground zero. Granted, they were settling debt, ideally, because that's what it was meant for,
Yeah.
but they were starting from ground zero. So that was a huge problem because it places a burden on the state in terms of retirement requirements. So there's that element. And then for those clients who were buying a personal retirement annuity, which is a personal pension fund through organizations like my own, they were putting money away monthly for retirement annuity. And even though they really needed the money and it was there, they could not access it, right? So those are those different types of clients. Now, in the new world, after 1 September, clients will not necessarily need to resign in order to access because of that savings pot that's being created. So while a lot of that money is being set aside in the vested pot, the accumulated money up to 1 September will be sitting in a vested pot, that money is meant to be there in order to preserve it for retirement. And then a portion of that is now put into the savings pot, which allows for access without needing to resign, right? So it does help, it mitigates that big problem that we were seeing. And on the retirement side, in organizations like my own, clients will now be able to access up to 30,000 Rand, 10% of their retirement value on 1 September or after 1 September, which they couldn't access before, which is meant to be able to give them some kind of financial relief if there is a really pressing financial emergency that they do not have access of funds anywhere else.
I know we haven't gone into detail on these questions, but following from what you've said, is when you say pressing need, will they have to have, on application, do they need to prove their financial need?
No, there's no big brother watching type of thing, not at all. I think that's where, we come in to make sure people understand that there's this benefit, but there's consequences. And so even though you do not have to prove emergency, because of the consequences, you'll have to think and consider your options to see, is the magnitude of the problem that I have, that I need the money for, is it big enough that I'm willing to take the consequences of taking the money out from this avenue as opposed to anything else?
One of the questions I had over the weekend when I was preparing for this with some of my colleagues who are financial planners, and one of the big thrusts they push is, well, there's a tax benefit. You get to claim back your retirement annuity contributions as a contribution to your system. And you mentioned now, just as a comment of, if they don't save enough for their retirement, then it impacts the state, which is granted. But then if the state gives a benefit to an individual from a tax perspective for saving for the retirement, but they're paying a retirement annuity to a private entity, is there a link, if any, between private sector and government? Because those funds are being paid to a private retirement fund in most cases, but everybody gets to claim it back from a tax perspective. So is there any relationship between the state and private? Because the state's giving money back for your contribution to a retirement annuity, but is there any link between the two?
Well, if I'm understanding you correctly, there's no benefit to the organization to say, we have some kind of deal or connection with what government allows in terms of tax deduction and the way we sell our products. But we've designed it to make sure that it meets the requirements that government requires in order so that the client can get the tax deduction. Yeah, so that's just the synergy between the government, the products being offered, and the client. So what we do is that we allow for the clients to be invested in the funds that they're allowed to be invested in for retirement annuities. We provide them with a tax certificate so that they can use that to claim their deduction back. So there's proof that they've contributed in the right type of product, and then they can get the deduction that the government allows.
If I understand, it's mutual benefits, but they're not interlinked.
Not at all, actually.
Because there's been a lot of questions around that on the back end, and I said, let's hear it from the horse's mouth, so to say. Is there a link? In terms of this new two-part system and the legislative changes, how will that affect two specific groups? Current retirees who are on their pension systems and future retirees.
So current retirees that are already in their pension system, it does not affect them because a retirement annuity or a pension and provident fund, those are pre-retirement products. The idea there is to amass an amount of money in which you buy an annuity with. If you already have bought your annuity and you're outside of your retirement annuities, then it does not affect you. But if you are still contributing in any way through a pension or provident fund, or if you have any money in a pension and provident fund or retirement annuity, and you haven't yet transitioned into an annuity post-retirement, then those products are impacted.
Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of allocation of funds, you mentioned specific approved products where investments go into. How will this two-pot system affect on how funds are allocated in the retirement funds? Because if I would understand what you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there's specific funds and tranches that the funds are put into. But now you've got two pockets or two pots of money. How are they invested in the same product that you draw from, or they invested in different products, one a savings product and one a longer term?
No, it's invested in the same product, but we'll just split the contributions. So if, for example, you're giving us 1,000 Rand, 1/3 needs to go into the savings component from 1st of September, and the other 2/3 will go into the retirement component. But say, for example, you've chosen to use a money market fund as your underlying investment fund on the product, the money will be invested in the same fund both ways, except that the 1/3 will be accessible and the other 2/3 not.
In terms of the benefit of these savings in the systems, who will benefit and what are the benefits of this change in the legislative landscape?
It was designed to allow the clients who are financially stressed and financially overwhelmed to get benefit from this system, right? Of course, there will be some benefit to the state and to organizations because they will see a lower impact on, or ideally, they will see a lower impact on resignations, and we'll see a greater preservation happening on pension and provident funds, right? So there is benefit different ways to different stakeholders in the system.
You've got different groups of consumers who take retirement annuities. You've got the lower income market, or if typically we say on the breadline, then your middle market, and then your higher income. Are there different impacts across the board, or will the legislation benefit all of them equally?
Well, it depends how the person is using the access, right? So I think the impact and the consequence could be even more dire to those who are living on the breadline. So they might need to take the money out in order to settle debt. But that's all the money that they have. And now suddenly they're even more impoverished when it comes to their retirement years, where someone who is financially well off could and might not necessarily access it really because they might have alternative funds. But should they access it, the impact on them in the future retirement planning could, yes, there's an impact, but in terms of the quality of life and being able to fund their retirement could be significantly less, right? So it is highly consequential. And that's why we have advisors that are skilled to be able to assess, what is the risk on this thing and should you be using this as an avenue as opposed to another.
Now, the more critical questions a lot of people are asking, what are the key concerns and complications of this new system, one for the consumer and two for the institutions on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, for the consumer, the key concerns that we have is, for one, people are now going to be even worse off in terms of their financial planning and their retirement readiness. Because prior to the two-part system and all the research that we've done and the research that we've seen out there, just over 20% of South Africans can afford to retire as it stands, right? However, more than 60% of South Africans are heavily indebted, living above their means. So there's two very significant problems, and we're trying to address the one where people are so heavily indebted, but it's consequently going to raise the other, where we're going to have even less people being able to retire comfortably. So that's a very significant problem. I think a big job that needs to be done as well is the education aspect, and that's where these kind of discussions come in, because clients are hearing that you can access money and they haven't really realized what are some of these consequences, what is the terms and conditions, because nothing is as simple as here, you have the money, you can take it,
Absolutely.
Yeah, even for those of us who are invested, just earning interest can sometimes be a consequence if your policies are not structured correctly. And now here you are having access to retirement funds, you're going to have a tax consequence immediately. So you think you get 1,000 Rand, but you're actually going to get 1,000 Rand minus whatever your marginal tax is due for
that. So
that.
they will be still taxed on this withdrawal?
Yes, all your withdrawals are taxed at your marginal rate. You're only allowed to do one withdrawal a year, so you're not going to have like multiple access to your retirement annuity. And then the other thing is that you're thinking about the present value of money versus the future value of money with compound interest, right? So for every 1 Rand that you're taking now, it could be worth 30 Rand in the future, depending on the time horizon that you have. So you have to weigh off that cost-benefit analysis to see.
Absolutely. In terms of Sanlam as an institution, what is the company doing for its clients and potential clients to address these concerns from an education, practical, and current client perspective of what should you do come 1 September?
Interestingly enough, that is one of my key responsibilities as the communication manager for the business, is to make sure that we are adequately preparing clients in a way that's digestible and meaningful to them around the impact of two-part, the T's and C's, the impact on their plan, the charges and fees that are related to this particular thing. So we have a heavy drive on all platforms, on all touch points where we know a client engages. So whether it's through social media, we've got social media campaigns, whether it's through our website, we've got information, AVs, one-pagers, calculators, all different mediums to try and get the message across, because people digest in different methods. So we've considered all those aspects. We've partnered with influencers even, so that even those people who are yet to buy a retirement annuity understand this new landscape and what it means for them. Because for every opportunity, there's a threat. And for every threat, there's an opportunity. So right now, this is also an opportunity for clients to start investing more in a retirement annuity. So we want to take them on that thought leadership journey as well. So we are trying to meet our consumers at every one of their touch points, at every point that's meaningful to them.
When you mentioned fees, and I know we touched on the tax implications earlier, my understanding with some exposure to the financial systems, and I actually grew up, my mom was a financial planner for 15, 17 years, I think. So I know this world fairly well, having spent a lot of my youth in it, is when a company, and a lot of my friends actually, so I know there's a pricing structure when a product is sold. There's certain costs that are built into the product, which is part of the business. Now that there's this administrative necessity, I wouldn't want to call it a burden, but it's a necessity based on legislation that people can access this takes resources and tools to get done. What are the implications for clients besides the tax portion? And I obviously can't ask for specifics, but will there be costs related to the withdrawal process from their pension funds?
I think for most organizations, if not all, that there would be an administrative charge for that process. Because like you rightfully said, there are people, there are systems, everything that needed to be invested in and a readiness that needed to happen in order to provide this service. So yes, it was a huge administrative cost on the organization, and therefore there is an administrative charge.
Absolutely. What would be the impact on a average individual who now has a retirement annuity or a provident fund in place? What is the long-term impact? And I know you briefly mentioned it as, in terms of the time value and the investment horizon, but what's the tangible impact for them as individuals, as families, and part of a community in a long-term strategy of, you may be solving a short-term problem, which may be critical at this point if they make that decision. But for those who just look at it as, well, I can access my money anyway for a holiday or a weekend, which may not be as urgent a necessity, what are the potential impacts on them, especially if they come from a family environment and they need to provide for more than one individual with their retirement?
As I said to you earlier, we've had a lot of stats to show that people are inadequately prepared for retirement as it stands, right? And only 20% or just over 20% of South Africans can afford to retire. And what that has consequently done for all the generations current and prior is that it's created that sandwich generation and that long line of what some people term black tax, and that those breadwinners that need to work for a lot longer than they need to. And when we make decisions that are granted they're based on the situation, seem like the best thing to do right now, but without thinking or having any foresight, we create that perpetual problem and we perpetuate the cycle over and over. So if you are a breadwinner and you are someone that needs to provide for multiple people, you need to consider the needs of your future self as well as the need of your present self. Because your future self will then probably have to work another 10, 15, 20 years, but would your health allow? Would the company even allow? Because we have a retirement age, so are you gonna be able to pivot? Are you gonna be able to find alternative sources of income? Or do you bite the bullet, try and amass as much as you can in these retirement vehicles so that there's a lot less pressure on your future self? Because your future self is older, it's probably less healthy, there's all those things you need to think about. And granted, it's very difficult, and that's another bit of research that we did. People are unable to see themselves as their future selves. We always provide for the present self, and we make decisions based on the present self. And that's something that we as Sanlam have been trying to create a narrative about as far and wide as possible, is how do you create a world for your future self that your present self is working toward. So based on those discussions, having conversations with a financial advisor can help you postulate those multiple scenarios and then think before you take any action, because then it will help you to understand what are the consequences to each of these actions and these routes.
Absolutely. But when you talk future self, and I think one of the key challenges we have, and it's not only a South African issue, it's a global issue, is when you're under significant financial pressure to provide for your family right now, you're paying for schooling, you're paying for a car or more than one car or transport, whatever your mode of transport is, you still need to get to work, you need to feed your family, and you're at that crunch point where you just can't make this work. You're rolling on credit cards, you're switching left to right, and you're saying, well, future self's great, but I'm starving now. And that's the colloquial challenge you sit. But when you talk about the education process, and this talks from a conversation I had with Dr. Pali Lehoshla, the former statistician general, he spoke, and maybe if you can or cannot let me know, but he spoke of different demographic groupings and legacy education in those families. Is that something that Sanlam has seen? That there are particular groupings who speak of legacy, and I won't mention the grouping you mentioned, it has a racial slur, but the focus is on when we talk sustainability and long-term future self, how do we maintain current and survive today? How do we build into a culture of a community in a broader rainbow community of the country of saving for the future?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And there's definitely that cultural aspect that's at play when it comes to the financial literacy or the mental models, rather, that we all have around finances, right? So the mental behaviors that we have. And there are strong cultural things that are at play that we see in these different demographics, guaranteed. And even as an organization, when we do our research, we make sure that we factor all these things in so that there's good representation to increase our understanding. And we have found that, in previously disadvantaged communities, the literacy gap is so large that even though a lot of us have jobs that we couldn't have had before because of our lack of financial literacy, we're still not thriving as we could have compared to our counterparts who had the benefit of financial literacy. So there is that aspect. And because we are aware of that, we are doing everything that we can to make sure that we are addressing people based on the fact that we know that there is a gap that was handed down from generation to generation based on where they came from. Right. And then one of the things that I also found very interesting, and it's an article of mine that went live today as well, is that the Generation Z, the current generation, there is a bit of a blended culture. So granted, we all come from different cultural roots from a racial perspective, but in the new age, because we are more influenced through tech and media, there's a more blended culture. So we're not identifying with our race so much as we're identifying with our peer groups. And based on that, there's huge opportunity for the future generations to have a more standardized level of financial education that is not discriminated by race and gender. And they're getting a lot of access to this information through these channels, and therefore it allows us to get to people easier and quicker and then share that financial literacy broadly. And we actually found in our research that this current generation is probably more likely to retire better than the generations before because of the level of awareness that they have and how they are generating income through multiple sources, where we have always taken traditional routes of acquisition. So there's those positives coming through that are breaking those generational cycles and those limitations on financial literacy.
But in trying to balance that, there's a traditional thinking, or at least some of the research shows, millennials and Gen Zs want instant gratification. They want solutions now. They live for today. And it's something that I deal with in mentorship programs and teaching at universities is, well, how do I get this experience? And typically a generic question is, there's only one way, or a response would be, how do you get 5 years experience? Well, I want to do this quickly. There's only one way to do it. Do the time.
Do the work, yes.
Do the work, get the experience, because you cannot exchange any amount of education, which is very useful, or any networking or social media, although it has its benefits, to substitute the actual hard work and the time that you do. So how do you balance instant gratification mentality with long-term future planning?
Look, you make a very valid point, because I also had, growing up in that in-between generation, more millennial, it's the same thing. You have to put in the time before you see yourself as certified and qualified to get to that next level. The interesting thing about the Generation Z people is that they are willing to do the thing that big organizations and stuff are learning to do now, to test and fail fast. Because we wait to get to a certain point in order to assess, to see, can we certify ourselves as a professional now, because we've gotten 10 years and we've gotten all the certifications through all the right boards. And they were like, well, I did a course, I tested it through some kind of prototype or some kind of experience, it didn't work, and now I'm pivoting. So there is that learning that's happening, but they are taking the route of test and fail fast, where we are going the long route. And so there's merit to both. But I think the way that they're doing it will allow them over time to gain vast amount of knowledge about multiple spheres of things, and not just be an expert in one thing, even though there is benefit to that. But I do think the way they are doing it eventually over time will amass to a large amount of information that they would have learned through practical trial and error.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm one who supports that thinking of the model of specialists are great. And I come from that world. I trained in medicine, trained in particular domains. And then I moved into other industries in parallel to that. And much to becoming an anomaly with my colleagues, they're like, what's this guy doing? Why is he playing in this space? But because I see the parallels and the synergistic benefit of being in that, and that's very unlike the millennial thinking or the older generations who think of that. And that it brings me to one of the conversations I had with a colleague of mine. He was one of the former divisional CEOs in Barlow. And he had made a comment to me, which I much respect, had said, Terence, when someone comes to us for employment, I don't want to see his experience of being at 20 organizations in 20 years. I want longevity, because if we invest in him, he needs to stay with us to some point. There's got to be a mutual value exchange. But that contradicts the current mentality of, well, I don't care about the loyalty of the institution per se. I'm not saying they're disloyal. Their focus is, what do I do for my own career trajectory? And that ties into their financial stability and long-term planning. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And I've been thinking about it even from a personal perspective, because I've also traditionally thought that it's better for me to stay and learn than to move, because I don't believe in moving for monetary gain. I believe in moving for how does this stretch you and teach you something different. But I think if you're someone who's employing and you're looking at a CV and the person has moved every year, but they did the same job to different organizations, probably for the monetary benefit, then that signals something. But if there's someone who's moved and has had different roles or different functions that they performed every time, you can see that this person is chasing growth, because they're looking, I was first in the IT department, and then I'm sitting in, in product development, and then I'm sitting in, group technology. Whatever the case is, you can see this person is, maybe the organization that they were in didn't allow them to move that way, but they're getting a systems view by moving around and learning different parts of different organizations so that they can create a systems view. So I think there's that lens. It's not as simple as this person moved 10 times. What do they do each time? Something different that is giving them a picture that is broader than someone who stayed in the same role for 10 years at the same organization and is now certified as a specialist in that thing. It doesn't allow for a systems view.
When you talk to this particular market, which is an important segment of the consumer base of digital content, and these conversations, is there are comments, and in preparation for this, we've been doing some research, and some of our research feedback has come back to say, well, it's great we get advice, and these legacy organizations, whether it's Sanlam or Mutual, and a range of them have been in industry forever, and they're solid institutions. But why is it that whenever a financial planner comes, it's an old man or an old woman?
Sure.
Because they say, now I'm talking to somebody my father's age, or almost my grandfather's age in a lot of cases, and I seem to share their sentiment, because financial planning seems to be, again, a long-term career path. But a lot of the individuals, and I can tell from my personal experience, a lot of them much older. And this generation sees that 20 to 30 age gap, saying, well, you don't understand my current needs. You're talking retirement, anti and pension because you're almost there. I've barely started and I've got more risk appetite. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's something that we're very much aware of as an organization. And that's why whenever we make a change like the two-part change, or if there's a product change, we consider who's taking it out and who's it being taken out to. So we consider, what does our distribution team look like, and is it relevant to the stakeholders or the end client that we want to speak to? So there has been a transformation, even on the advisor side, to bring in and attract these younger advisors. Because traditionally, a person back, I remember when I was in school, a lot of people who had a mainstream career, and if they were looking for an alternative or to pivot, became financial advisors, right? So that's how it was. But now we're looking to attract talent directly out of university for them to understand that this is a good career that they could pursue. It's not something that you pivot into later in life. So we're trying to bring in that advisor force that will match up the client base that we're attracting. Yeah. But alternatively, the people that the younger generation, they are also much more self-directed, right? So they don't necessarily want to sit in front of a Terence or a Fazana and ask them to look at all their finances. Because when you sit with an advisor, you print all your stuff and then you sit and you look at everything. They don't want that. They want, okay, I've read and I've researched and I just want to sense check, and then this is the product I want. Right? So they are more self-directed. Yeah. And for that, we have channels and methods to meet their needs so that we understand what is the behavior of the client and how do we match that behavior to our buying journey.
Makes perfect sense. In terms of this legislative changes that we're talking to in the two-part system, when did this start, and how has implementation been, if I could want to almost call it phased in as a process?
Yeah, it started, I think, just over 2 years ago in terms of when we heard about it impending, and I think we were expecting it late last year, then we were expecting it on the 1st of March this year, and then it officially became signed into law to take effect on the 1st of September. So it's been a journey, And in terms of the readiness, from the time we heard about it, we immediately went into project planning mode to understand what is the level of impact, what are the various areas that are impacted, and what changes need to be happen, and who do we need to speak to in order to verify our thinking. And that's where we started. And then from there, we started planning in terms of the product changes that needed to happen, system changes. And as I said, some of them have already been impacted or affected, and some of them will be affected by 1 September. And not just as a life insurer, even SARS needs to have a readiness to be able to collect the taxes that need to be paid. So there are a lot of institutions that are impacted by this change. There are a lot of various touch points that needed to be amended, and all of them are in the process of being synergistically adapted to make sure that there is some kind of seamless process that's in place once it becomes affected. And granted, there might be a lot of teething because it's one of the biggest legislative changes that we've seen in a long time. But we are ready to, adapt and respond accordingly as it happens.
As you mentioned, just in passing on the SARS issue, I think SARS has been pivoting itself not just for the two-part system. They've got access to everything.
Yes.
I've got domestic helpers who've come to us and said, but SARS has now sent me a letter. They have access to my Time Bank account. And I'm like, welcome to the new SARS. And they were just thinking, well, if we take a digital bank account, nobody's going to look.
Check.
And they said, listen, you're registered and you're compliant and everything's done. And SARS is now looking. They're desperately looking for funding and compliance. I'm not sure how beneficial that is to the broader system, because it creates a sort of invasive mentality where they're directly accessing bank accounts and sending you updates without even declaring it. That's a whole different conversation. But it seems they're keen and they want to get their hands on any cash they can.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for us to look at it that way. But I remember even as a kid, I used to always take pride in the fact that South Africa has one of the best tax collection systems in the world, right? So if there's something to brag about, there's that. Because I mean, whenever we do midterm budget speech and annual budget speech, we're all looking to see how is South Africa going to spend the money, how are they going to spend the money, where's the money coming from, and that budget is largely dependent on the money we can bring in effectively from tax, right? So yes, it is invasive and it's scary, but either we understand it contextually, because the way the budget is managed from a government point of view impacts us as consumers. Yes. And if they can bring down the inflation, and if we can manage GDP, then there's benefit to the consumer. So there's a cost here, but there's a benefit there. So,
I think added into that, the likes of road taxes like infrastructure development, road accident fund, and other related benefits on the system. But just think on a light note, some of the consumers are like, wow, these guys are getting aggressive.
I mean, I felt the same when it's tax season now, and you go into file and like everything is there. Like, it's like, there's no hiding. But then, like I said, I choose to rather frame my mind to think, whatever I lose here, I must get from somewhere else. And on that point, when it comes to things like retirement annuities, right? That's how we should think about it. Whatever I'm paying in contribution, I'm getting a tax deduction. There's ways in which the system can make you feel like it's taking from you, but there's also ways in which a person can get out of the system, right? Receive something. And that's where companies like us and our financial advisors, that's where they come in to help you to understand how to make the system work for you. So how do you get the benefits that are out there? So not to feel like you're just a sitting duck to whatever's happening.
And as a lay consumer, more importantly, and if I talk to the individuals that are salaried, not business owners, but if you're salaried, you have a post-tax amount that comes into your bank account. But if you can at least save a portion of that and contribute for your long-term retirement, and then still get a tax benefit for that, I think that's a win strategy.
Absolutely, right. And it's a double win, actually, because you get a tax deduction and the interest that you earn in that fund, you don't have to pay any tax on it. Whereas if you invested in a unit trust, for example, the interest that you earn, if it's over your exempted amount for the year, you have to pay tax on it. So not only are you using your after-tax income to invest, but then any interest you earn is potentially taxable as well. So it's a loss there, where if you're using tax-efficient vehicles, you're getting a rebate, plus you're avoiding the additional tax on the income. So there's ways in which to understand, learn the system, and make it work for you.
When we talk about this two-part changes and the two-part changes in the system, how has it affected some of the potential investment strategies and advice from the likes of Sanlam? For example, if you were investing in a product that's sort of medium risk, and you were going to get, say, R1 million at retirement for discussion's sake, but now you're drawing from that base capital or investment that you put in, and you potentially could only now land up at 500,000. is the advice changing to advise clients of saying, well, you can draw this if you really desperately have to, but maybe you need to adjust your risk appetite to try and close the gap? Yes, it comes with associated risks, but you could also try and close that gap. So you may not land up at 500, you end up at 700. So yes, you lose, but it comes with risk adjustment. Has there been any thinking around that?
Oh, absolutely. Our product team are well on their way to thinking about all those different scenarios, and our intermediary support team are well on their way to training our intermediaries to help them understand these different scenarios so that they can convey that kind of messaging and that kind of thinking when they're doing financial planning. So there's obviously lots of nuances that will come out in financial planning now as a result. There's opportunities to invest more. There's opportunities to take varying risks across your different portfolios based on, say you do want to access it, but you also plan to put more money in. How can we structure it such that you can do both? So all those nuances are at play, and as an organization, we take the responsibility of educating the distribution teams to make sure that they can have that conversation accordingly.
That makes sense. It's awesome. Tell me, in terms of if you're advising somebody today, somebody starting out retirement planning under this new two-part system, what advice would you, or as an organization, give to them at a high level at least?
Well, yeah, so obviously I'm not allowed to give advice
Hence
per
I
se,
packaged it.
but just as a consumer myself, right? When I'm listening to it, now it's so funny because everyone has different perspectives. In my own household, my husband was like, oh, I heard I can access money. I was like, no, you will not be accessing that money because you're going to pay tax on that money, so you will leave it right there. So the advice from a consumer perspective is that don't immediately do anything, right? So just because it's there doesn't mean you need to respond. Rather, take the route of educating yourself to understand, okay, this is what this means. And just because the money is there, do I need it? Or is there money elsewhere that I can access? Even a personal loan sometimes could be better than, paying the tax on your retirement, taking the money out, and then having a retirement shortfall later on. But those are different scenarios. So I would rather do nothing and educate myself than immediately respond just because it's there. Secondly, absolutely speak to an advisor before you make a decision. So even if you don't feel comfortable, if you don't have an advisor, at least reach out to Sanlam and ask, or any financial institution that you are associated with, ask for someone to speak to you so that you can clarify your thinking and do some sense checking. And then thirdly, if you're someone who is more self-directed, there are tools and resources that help you with that scenario planning. So if this, then that. If this, then that. So do multiple scenarios first before you make a decision. Right. So ultimately, that's what I would recommend just as a general consumer.
As a lay individual, and they want to come to Sanlam and they say, listen, I may not have your product, or I want to take your product. What are the cost implications for somebody starting out with financial planning, particularly talking to retirement? Are there costs associated with their consultations with financial planners?
No, advice is free, right? For most institutions or most advisors, advice is free. And products usually have their own fees and charges that are relayed on the particular product. And from there, we usually tend to pay the intermediary, right? So if you are afraid to speak to an intermediary or a professional financial advisor because you feel like it's going to come at a cost, just remember that advice and asking questions is free, and usually the product caters to all the expenses.
Because I think that's a big fear factor. I've had that with some of my staff and people that I speak to regularly, because we were prepping on this topic. They said, but why will they advise me for free? And I said, but it is. And it's the old idiom of there's no free lunch. And the guy's like, so what's the catch? I said, I don't think there is a catch, because I came from this world. I know it at least for almost 15 years, and I keep abreast of what's going on. But there's still this perspective of, no, they're not going to advise me for free or give me the best strategies until I sign up for a product.
No, so granted, and that's a misconception that we see everywhere. And every interview that I have, I always have to remind people that advice is free. So, and there's no catch, because even if you choose not to take a product, but you get an opportunity to speak to an expert who helps you to even just understand your financial position as it is, just to get a lay of your land right now, that in itself is a win for you. And usually the products that they're selling you, it's not like you're going to buy something at the store and now you have this item that you bought and then you have a grudge purchase. It's more, the product is more a solution to a need. So it's not like you're buying a static product. You're buying a solution. And that's the only time you're actually making a purchase is if you decide that I have a need that's big enough that this solution is the right solution for you. And that's how you need to see it. So if you have a retirement gap, a retirement annuity is a solution. If you have a tax problem, a tax-free savings or retirement annuity is a solution. So you're not just buying a product, you're getting a solution. And that in itself makes a financial impact. So the benefit outweighs the initial
Yes.
cost of the product.
So
Yeah.
we've now focused on the younger generation consumers and a long-term investment horizon. Now let's look at somebody in their 50s, 55, 60, and they've got 4 or 5 years left. But they, at the tail end of their careers, if you could call it that from a tax perspective, they're very close to pension. They're also probably not earning as much as they need, and they've got pressing financial needs. And now you open this opportunity to say, well, you can access your capital. And in my mind, a fair portion of the argument of your long-term horizon falls away. What advice would you have for somebody much closer, and obviously as opposed to somebody much younger on this two-pot system?
Well, before this two-pot system became a reality, typically we would advise people at that point to say, try and squash as much debt as you possibly can. You need to skinny up your life as much as you can in that years and put the extra money into a retirement annuity. And I think that advice still holds. So you want to be able to reduce your debt, but reducing debt does not necessarily mean taking cash out of one place and putting it somewhere else. It could mean that you need to adjust your lifestyle. And granted, it's difficult, but sometimes those difficult choices need to be made on your expenditure so that you can still keep contributing to retirement annuity, because in 5 years' time, you need that money. So you need, again, to put more money in if you can and reduce your debt. And that narrative holds true whether it was pre or post two-pot.
Now, let's talk pre and post COVID. There is a anomaly of people saying, well, it's great to save, but I may not get there. What if there's another pandemic or another challenge? What would be, and without holding you to it, I mean, what would be high-level advice to people who have this doomsday mentality, which is reality? People have pivoted from long-term planning to say, well, I've lost so many people in my, I've lost too many, so I may not get there.
That's a very real thing that we've been dealing with, a narrative that we've been seeing in the media. But what we're finding, there's two sides of that coin. So some people were thinking, oh, life's too short, I should just live. But majority of people were like, oh, I was not financially prepared for COVID. If something like this has to happen to me again, I want to be financially prepared. So what we're seeing is that a lot more people are trying to save. There's actually been a bigger savings culture post-COVID than there was pre-COVID, because they realized the impact of them having no savings at all, right? So there's that. One of the other things that COVID brought to the forefront for a lot of people is that people can live on less, because suddenly losing your income, a lot of people were not earning any money whatsoever. So they didn't have any option other than to really, really cut down to the basics, so much so that you have people moving back in with their parents. They have people who are doing housemates again, where before people would have 2-bedroom apartments for themselves. So all those things made them realize, actually, I can take a little bit of discomfort, and that means that I have a lot more money. So people are now willingly allowing themselves to be uncomfortable so that they can have more money, right? So there's that learning that's coming through. And I think that if COVID has made us realize that, yes, there's mortality risk, but there's also that risk of having no income and being alive, then I'd rather prepare for that worst case scenario than if I would die tomorrow and have R1 million in the bank, because one is more plausible than the other.
Very true. In terms of the legislative changes, what other changes or regulatory changes do you anticipate as an institution to retirements or otherwise?
Nothing that we are working on currently, right? Some while ago, there was the retirement reform that we were expecting to come into play. But right now, the biggest thing for us is just two-pot. And there's nothing that we see currently that feel like we need to respond to. But as an organization that works very, very closely with the regulatory bodies and with Parliament and everything else, we usually are made aware of things well enough in time so that we can adapt and respond where necessary.
In terms of education around these legislative changes, which you say Sanlam has been doing aggressively, and I've obviously seen a lot of it, will it continue to just 1 September, or is it a long-term strategy to access the different stratas of community to understand more about their retirement planning and financial planning?
Even as it stands as a business, we are looking post 1 September to understand consumer behavior as a result of the change. Because as new insights present itself to us, then we will know how to adapt our products, how to create market-leading features. Because at the end of the day, this change impacts all organizations equally, right? But the ones who are going to come out on top are the ones who innovate and respond in the most appealing way to the consumer. So for that reason, we're going to stay as close as possible to the insights and the research that is coming through after the implementation, so we can see what is driving behavior, what is the thinking, how are people responding, what are some of their fears and concerns, what are some of their questions, and we're going to use that to inform our decision making.
In recent months, and I've heard of some research that Sanlam has specifically commissioned, focusing on retirement planning, the two-part system. Could you talk to that for a bit?
Yeah, so we just had our benchmark survey come through. We usually do that once a year, and it gives us a lot of industry insights around the different areas like healthcare and corporate benefits and investments. A very interesting finding was that there's a very low level of trust among consumers around industry and around politics. So there's a low trust culture that's going on. People feel, and as you said as well, it feels like SARS is looking at your bank account and they feel like there's no privacy. People feel like, we're being invaded upon and we are being told what to do. So there's that aspect coming through. We also find that more than 80% of South Africans are financially stressed. So the stress that they're experiencing that's causing other maybe health-related issues or psychological issues is coming from their financial situations. So those things influence, the things that we do in terms of financial planning, the way in which we manage our budgets, and the way in which we show up at work. Now, if we're not healthy and we're not showing up at work, it impacts our organization's performance, it impacts our own income. So there's a whole systemic effect based on the way consumers are feeling right now.
Just completely, slightly divergent from the two-part system. You mentioned in passing that people are now stressed, it impacts their health, and this then leans into the conversation of work from home. Previously, people would get up early. This is at least a perception. It's not my view, but there are some views on it that say, well, people would wake up early, get ready, go to work. Yes, there's a rush, but you get to work. You're having to walk around, meet people, go to meetings, move around the organization wherever you need to, travel for meetings if necessary, and come back. Then you get home. Even though you may not make time to dedicatedly exercise, you've got less time for junk food. You've got people around you all the time, and you actually have to move about in your work environment. And then the strong messaging of, well, work from home means you could stay in your pajamas the entire day with a packet of Doritos next to you and just go on the whole time and say, well, it's less stressful than driving on the road, but you don't realize the long-term impact that it has on your health.
Absolutely. There was research that we did, and now it sounds like we research everything, but obviously we need data to inform our decisions, right? So last year we found that people were feeling lonely and it was impacting their mental health, but they at the same time count themselves as more productive. Right. So yes, there's an element of being connected to the bigger group and cluster because it makes you feel purposeful and connected as opposed to that loneliness. But in terms of there are certain occupations that are output driven, and people who have those occupations who are working from home finally feel like they are able to do and deliver what they are unable to deliver at the office. So there's both aspects, but guaranteed, and we see this even from a wellness perspective, that as a result of people working from home, especially people who don't have family and support systems, there's a lot more, depressive episodes, stress, anxiety, because they don't have that interaction. And that's why organizations have shifted to, instead of a complete work from home system, there's a hybrid system, which tries to balance the best of both. So at best, you go to the office and you see your colleagues twice a week or 3 times a week, and you have that opportunity to connect. And then you have the other days to be hyper efficient and get as much as you can.
And I think that makes perfect sense because that touch point connects you. And it's that human bonding. Leave alone the ability to meet. It's that ability if you want to share ideas, you've got people around you. Not necessarily trying to call someone and they're stuck in a Teams call or some other call where you could pop into the office, knock on a door and say, 5 minutes, we need to chat.
Unrelated, I read a study some years ago that people who have good peer networks and who are even married or have good friendship groups in their retirement age tend to live longer than people who are alone, because that connectedness allows for vitality and mental energy, and it keeps you active and social, keeps your mental faculties at a good level. So, being connected to something, it speaks to both longevity as well as your mental health.
And I don't think it's only about retirement age. And I'm involved personally in a range of executive business-related organizations. And you need to find these safe spaces to connect with individuals, not necessarily the same industry, but like-minded individuals who have similar challenges, even if it's in different countries and different geographies, because you learn from that environment. So in a non-prescriptive environment, those are very useful to me. And, it talks to the old idiom of your net worth is your network. because you grow from others' experiences and you grow from that connectivity. And sometimes it's merely a reference or a phone call that makes all the difference because it's somebody you want to talk to that makes time for you to connect with that.
And just that feeling that you are important enough that that person made time for you, right? But what you said about, having that like-mindedness, and it's interesting, I find I go to gym a lot and I see a lot of young kids coming through, the Gen Zs, and I interact with them a lot. And the amount of learning that helps me to stay relevant that I get from having conversations with them. So granted, we're not like-minded at all, but I'm hoping that they're getting something from me and I'm getting something from them. And there's this transfer of knowledge. There's no, gatekeeping. So it is allowing them to be wise and me to be wise at the same time. So having interactions with both like-minded or people in your peer group and outside of your peer group is what's really going to expand your awareness of, and help you to stay relevant. And that is very, very important, that relevance to the ever-changing environment that we're in. Yeah.
So in rounding up, Farzana, any closing comments on the two-part system and any views from yourself and or Sanlam?
Absolutely. I think one of our primary views around the two-part is that it is not a negative thing, nor is it necessarily 100% positive thing, right? There's a happy medium that needs to be established in terms of this. There's a purpose that it was intended for, and we want our consumers to understand what that purpose is and to be mindful when deciding, does this purpose meet my need, or is it just there, but it's there for someone who actually desperately needs it, So there's that. So we don't have an extreme view to say it's a good or a bad thing. We believe that it has the potential to be good, but we want people to be mindful and to be critical in their thinking when it comes to accessing this money. We also absolutely, in every conversation, advocate for the value of advice. Because yes, we are a product house and we design things in certain intentions, but we have our expert advisors. Just like medical tools are only as useful as the professional that's using it, right? It's the same as we design the products and we allow our distribution teams to take it out to the people. We want the people to connect with those distribution teams to make educated, informed decisions that this is the right procedure, the right surgical thing for them in this moment, and this is the right product. So don't try. Yes, I believe you need to take the onus on yourself to educate yourself, but that means also seeking expert advice. It doesn't just mean reading as many articles as I can. So the onus is on you to ask questions and ask it of skilled professionals so that you can bridge that knowledge gap.
Absolutely. And to speak to exactly what you've said, I've had that many times where patients come in for consultations and there's, I read a comment, I think it was a tweet and someone had put in to say, don't confuse your Google search with my medical degree.
Oh, yes.
And that is probably the same thing in the financial world. You can search all you want, but you need somebody who's dedicatedly trained and experienced in this environment to make or at least help you make the right decision.
Yeah, just sense check at the very least, right? Because we only know what we know, and sense checking with someone else will help us to know.
Thank you for making the time, and it's been a great pleasure.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
This conversation's been with Farzana Botha of Sanlam. And for any future advice, please reach out to your financial institutions to consider what is best for you in the two-part retirement system.